The history taught in schools often feels like a building with a beautiful facade, hiding completely different, much more mysterious structures behind it. We are accustomed to trusting the official timeline, yet there is a little known but striking detail that could completely rewrite what we know about our past. This seemingly insignificant detail has been in plain sight for centuries, captured in marble and on canvas, but we have stubbornly refused to give it the importance it deserves. We are talking about the physical appearance of those who inhabited our planet before the early 20th century. Specifically, a unique anatomical feature that radically distinguishes the ancient elite from modern humans. If we cast aside the habit of merely skimming the surface and carefully examine the surviving heritage of antiquity, whether majestic statues or old paintings, we can notice a strange but consistent pattern. At first glance, these seem like ordinary people, the usual body structure, 2 arms, 2 legs. However, once you focus on the profile, a completely atypical facial structure immediately catches the eye. It is not even the size of the nose that draws attention, but specifically the area of the bridge, the place where the respiratory organ connects to the frontal bone. In the vast majority of modern people, there is a natural indentation here, a dip under the brow ridges. But in key figures of ancient history, this feature is completely absent. Looking at images from ancient Egypt or ancient Greece, we see a perfectly straight line. The forehead flows smoothly, without the slightest curve, dip, or pit, into a straight, massive nose. For decades, skeptics and art historians have dismissed this as the so-called Greek profile, an artistic canon, a stylization, or an attempt to idealize appearance. We are told that sculptors tried to convey divine beauty by sacrificing realism. However, this theory begins to fall apart when it comes to statues found during actual archaeological excavations, in layers that rule out modern forgeries. Artifacts pulled from the ground, for instance in the Gaza Strip, or discovered during massive bridge construction projects, possess these same uncompromising characteristics. This is not a symbolic mask, but a detailed, scrupulous reproduction of anatomy, where the bone structure is rendered with frightening accuracy. The heads of ancient heroes like Alexander the Great, Olympian gods like Hermes, Artemis, Dionysus, or the famous Aphrodite invariably have this specific profile. The line of the forehead and nose forms a single vector, creating a look that would seem alien and perhaps even frightening to us today. It is important to note that sculptors did not bestow these features upon everyone. Common people, craftsmen, and slaves were depicted differently. Their faces were closer to the appearance we are used to, with ordinary nose bridges. This straight profile was the hallmark of a privileged class, an undeniable marker of a higher caste. One gets the distinct impression that ancient masters were not fantasizing, but documenting with precision the appearance of beings who actually lived, ruled, and were considered the standard of power. If this phenomenon were limited exclusively to the territory of ancient Greece or Rome, one could try to explain it as a local genetic mutation, or the isolated fashion of a single people. But the facts are relentless and suggest otherwise, forcing us to expand our search horizons. The geography of the straight nose extends far beyond the Mediterranean, covering vast territories and breaking down the usual boundaries of historical eras. What we are used to considering a feature of ancient Europe turns out to be just a fragment of a global mosaic, traces of which lead us much further east and south, hinting at the existence of a single ruling stratum throughout the ancient world. The geography of this phenomenon expands at an alarming rate once you delve into museum reserves and archaeological expedition reports across the Eurasian continent. If we shift our focus from the familiar European capitals to the east, the picture does not change. Instead, it acquires an even more global and mysterious scale. In the territories of ancient Persia, in the lands of modern-day Iraq and Iran, Researchers find sculptural portraits of rulers whose profiles are identical to the faces of Greek gods or Roman Caesars. We see the same continuous line connecting the forehead and the tip of the nose, the same high cheekbones and specific eye placement. This seems incredible, as local tribes possessed a completely different anthropological type, yet their stone idols and kings look like aliens from another world. Moving further east, we discover similar evidence in India and even in Afghanistan. One of the most striking examples is the famous find known as the Genius of the Flowers, discovered in the Afghan sands. The facial features of this character have nothing in common with the indigenous population of the region. It is the same monolithic profile, devoid of a dip, that we saw in Athens and Thebes. Fragments of ancient murals in cave temple complexes in Asia, for example in Jhansi, also capture people with this characteristic, almost architectural facial feature. We end up with a paradoxical situation. Across the vast expanses from the Nile to the Indus, covering Europe, Africa, and Asia, the ruling elite possessed a unified appearance. It is important to understand the social context of creating such works of art in antiquity. Statues, bas-reliefs, and ceremonial portraits were never made in honor of commoners, peasants, or merchants. Stone and marble were the privilege of power. This means that the depicted people belonged to the highest caste, the elite who held the fates of nations in their hands. Logic suggests that rulers in Central Asia or India should have come from local influential families and borne the ethnic traits of their subjects. But art stubbornly testifies to the contrary. The rulers of different countries and continents looked more like each other than like their own peoples. It is as if they belonged to a single, separate biological species or a closed clan that extended its influence over the entire civilized world of that time. This transcontinental resemblance of rulers makes one wonder about the existence of a single genetic line that controlled the key civilizations of antiquity. These were people, or beings, whose main distinguishing mark was a massive, straight nose transitioning into the forehead without the slightest hint of a bridge. However, a skeptic might object. Perhaps we are dealing with a global fashion, an ancient canon of beauty that sculptors simply copied from region to region, ignoring the real appearance of their patrons? Was this not just an artistic device designed to glorify the leader by giving him the features of a deity? To destroy this doubt, we must leave the dusty halls of ancient museums and transport ourselves to an era when realism became the main criterion of art. If the straight profile were merely an invention of ancient masters, it should have disappeared with the arrival of new times. But this did not happen. Moreover, evidence of the existence of this mysterious race can be found not only on the canvases of the great Renaissance painters, who strove for anatomical accuracy, but also on items that might be in your pocket or wallet right now if you look at the history of currency. The Renaissance, which proclaimed a return to ancient ideals, was actually not just a period of copying ancient forms, but a time of documenting reality. Great masters of the brush, like Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael, were not just artists, but also scrupulous researchers of anatomy. Leonardo, known for his obsession with the structure of the human body, and who performed dissections to understand the truth, would hardly have distorted the facial features of his models for the sake of a fictional canon. Peering into the portraits of that era, such as the famous Lady with an Ermine, or Raphael's Madonnas, we discover the same characteristic profile, a high forehead line flowing smoothly into the nose without the slightest depression. Italian painters of the 16th century captured the elite of their time with photographic precision, and these faces surprisingly repeat the features of statues created thousands of years before them. This confirms that the carriers of the divine profile did not vanish with the fall of Rome, but continued to occupy dominant positions in the European hierarchy. However, even more surprising evidence is kept by numismatics, the science of coins. Money has always been a symbol of state power, and the images on it were approved with particular care. If we trace the evolution of coinage in the United States of America, a striking chronology of changes in human appearance is revealed. For 2 centuries, starting from the first issues at the end of the 18th century and up to 1909, the profiles depicted on cents and dollars invariably demonstrated that same antique trait. Coins from 1793, 1797, 1809, and even 1908 bear images of faces with perfectly straight noses forming a single line with the forehead. This was an approved state standard, apparently reflecting the standard of appearance accepted in the highest circles of that time. But then, an inexplicable break occurs. The year 1909 becomes a point of no return. Suddenly, without visible reasons, the style changes radically. On coins issued after this date, in 1916, 1921, and later, the profiles acquire modern, familiar traits. A distinct indentation appears at the bridge of the nose, that very angle between the forehead and nose which is characteristic of an ordinary person. The character on the coins formally remains the same, a symbol of liberty or a historical figure, but their anthropology is completely rewritten. Why did the artists at the Mint, who had followed one tradition for centuries, suddenly forget how to draw straight noses? Or did the change occur not in art, but in reality itself? This sharp transition suggests that it was at the beginning of the 20th century that a change of eras occurred, not only political, but also biological. The old people, or rather the old elite, with their characteristic straight profiles, began to disappear from the visual field, giving way to the modern face type even on state symbols. Skeptics may object, claiming that portraits and engravings on metal are merely the result of artistic fiction or changing fashion trends. A painting can be repainted, a coin die can be melted down, but there is evidence that cannot be faked or attributed to an artist's fantasy. The Earth preserves physical proofs that are far more eloquent than any images, and these proofs lie in the realm of pure anatomy hidden in ancient burials. If skeptics can still try to explain images on coins or painters' canvases as artistic fiction, stylization, or quirks of fashion, there is a category of evidence that is impossible to argue with. This is biology itself, frozen in bone. To finally confirm the hypothesis of the existence of a special type of people who ruled the ancient world, it is necessary to turn to archaeological finds that literally extract the anatomy of the past from oblivion. We are talking about skulls whose structure differs radically from the standards of modern Homo sapiens. These artifacts are scattered across museums around the world, but they share one frightening detail that correlates perfectly with those Greek profiles on ancient statues. Upon close examination of skulls discovered in completely different corners of the planet, from burials in Budapest and Stuttgart, Germany, to ancient necropolises in Peru and underground sanctuaries in Malta, a striking picture emerges. In a modern human, the cranium has a clearly defined facial architecture. The brow ridges protrude forward, and beneath them, where they connect to the nose, there is a natural indentation. This is the anatomical norm for our species. However, skulls attributed to ancient nobility and priesthood are constructed by nature differently. They have almost no brow ridges, and the frontal bone transitions into the nasal bone in a straight line, without the slightest depression. At the bone level, there is no step like the one you and I have. This is especially pronounced in the owners of so-called elongated dolichocephalic skulls. Historians often try to explain the elongated head shape with artificial deformation, the tradition of binding babies' heads. But even if we assume that the shape of the cranium can be changed mechanically, no bandages can change the structure of the facial bone and remove a genetically inherent nose bridge. The skull from Budapest or the Peruvian finds demonstrate that the absence of a depression is a congenital trait, not an acquired one. This means that in life, such a person's face had that same ideal straight profile we see on statues of Egyptian pharaohs and Greek gods. The soft tissues simply had nowhere to sink in. They fit tightly over this specific bone structure, creating a single line from the hairline to the tip of the nose. Comparing these facts leads to an inevitable conclusion. Ancient sculptors were the greatest realists. They did not invent divine features. They sculpted from life. Those depicted in marble, rulers, generals, gods descended to earth, really possessed a different anatomy. It was a biologically distinct species or subspecies, for whom a straight nose and often an elongated head shape were natural species traits. Remains of these beings are found throughout Eurasia, and they are always associated with rich burials, gold, and attributes of supreme power. The nosed minority is not a metaphor, but a paleoanthropological fact. But if we admit that this species existed physically, a logical and disturbing question arises. Where did they disappear to? It is generally accepted that such oddities remained in deep antiquity, before our era. However, if we carefully trace the history of European dynasties, it becomes obvious that these beings did not die out with the mammoths. They did not dissolve into the centuries, but continued to occupy thrones and decide the fates of nations much longer than textbooks tell us. Their faces looked at us from ceremonial portraits until quite recently. We just forgot how to notice them. Studying the genealogy of European monarchs reveals a shocking truth. They were here, among us, just a couple of centuries ago. If we carefully trace the facial features of those who decided Europe's fate over the last 500 years, it becomes obvious that so-called blue blood is not just a beautiful metaphor for aristocratic origin. It is a very concrete biological marker passed down from generation to generation, persisting with enviable stubbornness right up to the 19th century. The portrait gallery of European monarchs is not just a collection of images of different people, but essentially variations of the same face moving from one royal bedroom to another, disregarding state borders. The brightest example of this genetic continuity is the famous Marie Antoinette. Fashion historians often discuss her elaborate hairstyles, but rarely ask what exactly these complex hair constructions were hiding. And judging by surviving images from her youth and later periods, they were hiding an atypically elongated skull shape. But the main thing is the profile. The Queen of France possessed that same reference standard straight nose, flowing smoothly into the forehead, which we saw on ancient cameos. And this is not surprising, for she was flesh and blood of the Habsburg dynasty, a family that cultivated its exclusivity for centuries. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, and all her numerous relatives, brothers Joseph II and Leopold II, demonstrate the same architectural facial features. These are high foreheads and massive, straight noses without a hint of a bridge, giving their appearance something not quite human when compared to the faces of their own subjects. This family stamp was not a local feature of the Austrian court. A genetic network, like a spiderweb, covered all of Western Europe. Look at the Stuart dynasty, or the Danish kings. Anne of Denmark, wife of King James I, appears in ceremonial portraits with an ideal, almost unnaturally straight profile. Her mother, Sophie of Mecklenburg-Güstrow, and her grandmother from the House of Pomerania possessed the same features. It was a closed circle. The Spanish Bourbons, specifically King Charles III, also bear this indelible imprint. A characteristic nose that is impossible to confuse with anything else. One gets the impression that all these monarchs, kings of Spain, England, Austria, Denmark, were not just relatives, but representatives of a single clan, biologically distinct from the rest of Europe's population. They intermarried only within their circle, not merely for political reasons, but perhaps to preserve the purity of this specific genotype. Thus, until the 19th century, Europe was ruled by one big family, whose physical characteristics, a straight Greek nose and a special skull shape, served as a pass to the throne. It was a caste of untouchables, whose appearance served as proof of their right to power. But the most surprising thing is that this genetic expansion did not stop at the borders of the Catholic and Protestant worlds. Traces of this mysterious race of rulers lead further east, penetrating behind the Iron Curtain of history, straight into the heart of the Russian Empire. Official historiography insists on a unique national path for Russian czars, but impartial portraits testify that the Russian throne was also occupied by people whose profiles suspiciously resembled their Western cousins, casting doubt on everything we knew about the origin of the Romanov dynasty. It would be naive to believe that the Russian Empire, being an integral part of the world political arena, remained on the sidelines of this global genetic network. If we cast aside patriotic myths and look at the Romanov dynasty through the prism of anthropology, a picture emerges that is completely identical to what we observed in Western palaces. The Russian throne was occupied by people with the same specific facial features as the rulers of Spain or Austria, which casts serious doubt on the version of their exclusively local origin. Let's begin the analysis with one of the most iconic figures, Peter the Great. His reformist activities and gravitation towards Europe are known to everyone, but few pay attention to his physiognomy as captured by contemporary masters. The face of Russia's first emperor possesses that same characteristic geometry, a powerful, straight nose forming a single line with the forehead. This feature can be traced in portraits from his youth and in images from his mature years. His father, Alexei Mikhailovich, also possessed an impeccably straight profile, but even more interesting conclusions can be drawn by studying the female line. Peter's mother, Natalia Kirillovna Narishkina, bore a traditional Russian name, but her appearance is the standard of European aristocracy of that time. Her profile is indistinguishable from the profiles of Austrian archduchesses or French princesses, as if she were cast from the same mold. Taking us even deeper into history is the image of Eudoxia Lukyanovna Streshneva, the wife of the first Tsar of the Romanov dynasty, Michael Romanov. Official history says she was chosen as a result of a bride show in 1626, meaning, in essence, she was a random girl from the nobility who won a beauty contest. However, her facial features speak to the contrary. In surviving images, we see a woman with a perfectly regal nose and a high skull, who is indistinguishable from the daughters of the King of Spain or the Queen of Austria. The probability that a random Russian noblewoman accidentally coincided in phenotype with a narrow group of the world elite tends toward zero. This suggests that either her origin was different, or the ruling class of Russia initially belonged to the same biological species as the rulers of the rest of Eurasia. This line of blood purity can be traced further. Look at Peter III, the grandson of Peter the Great. Despite his complex reputation, his profile remains canonical, straight, without a dip, exactly like his European contemporaries of the mid-18th century. Anna Petrovna, daughter of Peter I, passed this gene on. It seemed this breed of people would rule forever. But the 19th century arrives and the mechanism breaks. If we trace the evolution of the faces of Russian emperors towards the end of the dynasty, we see a gradual but relentless disappearance of the divine trait. In Paul I, the profile is no longer so ideal, although the general outlines remain. Alexander II and Alexander III increasingly approach the appearance of an ordinary person. And finally, Nicholas II. The last Russian Tsar has practically nothing in common with his distant ancestors in terms of skull structure. He develops a distinct nose bridge, a pit between the forehead and nose, characteristic of modern Homo sapiens. The royal nose disappeared. This process of degradation or dilution of traits occurs synchronously all over the world. It is precisely in the 19th century, at the turn of the 20th, that we observe how a whole species of rulers literally dissolves. They disappear from paintings, they stop being minted on coins, and they are replaced by people with ordinary anatomy. The genetic line that held power for millennia was interrupted or went into the shadows. But what was the reason for this disappearance? Why did the nosed minority, which had so long and confidently controlled civilization, suddenly give up its place on the forefront of history? And, most importantly, did they really disappear without a trace, or did they simply change tactics? Summing up this massive historical investigation, we are faced with a fact that is impossible to ignore. For millennia, from the dawn of the first great civilizations of Egypt and Sumer, right up to the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, humanity was ruled by a narrow, biologically distinct group of beings. This nosed minority, as we have tentatively called it, knew no borders. They occupied thrones in Europe, Asia, and Africa, passing power and specific genetic markers to their descendants. Their distinguishing feature, a straight profile devoid of a bridge, and often an elongated skull shape, was not just an aesthetic whim, but a kind of mark of quality, a seal of the right to own the world. However, the 20th century, a century of world wars and the fall of empires, became a turning point when the traces of this ancient caste began to rapidly fade. Officially, the era of kings and emperors ended or transformed into decorative constitutional monarchies, where rulers no longer make real decisions. But does this mean that the biological species that held the reins of government for thousands of years just up and vanished? The logic of power suggests that elites do not dissolve into thin air, they transform. If we shift our gaze from empty thrones to the boards of directors of transnational corporations and banking conglomerates, we see an interesting picture. Consider, for example, the patriarchs of modern financial dynasties, such as the Rothschilds or Rockefellers. In the facial features of some representatives of these families, especially the older generation, one can glimpse echoes of the old blood familiar to us from ancient statues. Of course, time and mixing with ordinary people have done their job. The perfectly pure Greek god type with an absolutely straight forehead-nose line is extremely rare today. However, even in a diluted form, this genetics makes itself felt. A specific facial architecture, a heavy gaze, a particular way of holding the head. In figures like David Rockefeller or Jacob Rothschild, one could notice certain anthropological features that distinguish them from the crowd, reminding us of ancient roots. This allows us to assume that the masters of history have not gone anywhere. They simply changed tactics. Instead of openly demonstrating their otherness on gold coins and marble pedestals, they chose to go into the shadows, becoming less noticeable to the general public. Here we approach the main, perhaps the most frightening question of our entire investigation. Who were these beings really? If their bone structure, the absence of a depression at the nose bridge, a different shape of the cranium, differed so radically from the anatomy of Homo sapiens, can we even call them humans in the usual sense of the word? Biology is relentless. Such significant differences in skeletal structure usually indicate belonging to another subspecies or even species. Perhaps all this time, while humanity was building cities and fighting wars, it was ruled by a parallel branch of evolution, more developed, organized, and ruthless. Their disappearance from the forefront at the beginning of the last century may not be extinction at all, but a brilliant act of mimicry. In a world where appearance began to play a smaller role than capital and information, it became more profitable for them to blend in with their surroundings. They could have intentionally diluted their blood to erase overly obvious differences, while preserving their inner essence and levers of influence. Or perhaps they learned to hide their true features using the achievements of modern medicine and a closed lifestyle. We look at modern politicians and see ordinary faces with ordinary noses. But who stands behind them? Perhaps that very ancient race hasn't gone anywhere. They simply stopped posing for artists, realizing that real power loves silence. And maybe, right now, walking past the mirrored skyscrapers of financial centers, we are much closer to solving the mystery of the ancient gods than we would like to think.